Secret operation in France. I remember the night as if it happened yesterday. The damp air of the Normandy countryside, thick with the scent of wet earth and distant smoke, clung to my uniform as I crouched in the shadows of an old stone farmhouse. My fingers, numb from the cold, tightened around the grip of my revolver. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted, a sound so ordinary it should have been comforting. Instead, it sent a jolt of unease through me. The war had taught me that silence was a lie. True quiet didn't exist in occupied France. If you couldn't hear German boots marching or the murmur of voices in the distance, it only meant they were moving carefully, hunting, waiting. And on that night, in the spring of 1944, I knew they were hunting me. I had been working with the French resistance for months, slipping between identities like a man shedding skins. To some, I was a lost traveler. To others, a mute farmhand. But to those who knew the truth, I was George Henderson, an American OSS agent sent to help cripple German defenses before the invasion. It was a dangerous game, and the stakes were death. That night, my mission was simple: meet my contact near the church ruins in Saint-Mir-Église, confirm the next shipment of explosives, and disappear into the night. The kind of task I had done a dozen times before. But war has a way of turning routine into chaos. The church's bell tower loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the star-pierced sky. I moved carefully, my boots sinking into the mud, every step a calculated risk. Somewhere nearby, a cow shifted in its pen, snorting softly. A normal sound, a safe sound. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps stopped. My mind raced. It could be anyone, a resistance fighter, a villager out past curfew, or the worst possibility of all. I gripped the handle of my revolver tighter, forcing myself to keep breathing, to listen. A whisper of fabric. Breath too close. I spun, gun raised, but before I could fire, a rough hand clamped over my mouth, yanking me backward into the shadows. The grip on my face was firm, calloused fingers pressing into my skin, and for a split second, panic flared in my chest like a spark in dry grass. But then just as quickly, I caught the scent of tobacco and old leather, the faintest trace of something metallic, gun oil, perhaps. Not the cheap, acrid smell of German cigarettes, nor the pungent odor of sweat that clung to a soldier's uniform after hours of patrol. This was something different, something familiar, and before I could decide whether to struggle or surrender to whatever fate had grabbed me, a voice rasped into my ear in quick, urgent French. Ne bouge pas, imbecile. Tu veux mourir. Don't move, idiot. Do you want to die? I knew that voice. I had heard it countless times over the past few months, whispering in the dark, passing messages in hushed tones, laughing quietly over stolen bottles of cheap wine after successful sabotage missions. Louis Moreau, my closest contact in the resistance, the man who had somehow made it his personal mission to keep me alive despite my foreign accent, my reckless confidence, and the ever-present risk of discovery. His breath was hot against my ear, but before I could whisper a reply, he removed his hand and shoved me backward, deeper into the darkness of a nearby alleyway, his own body a tense silhouette against the moonlit stones of the church wall. I barely had time to register his presence before I heard what he had heard first, the unmistakable clatter of boots on cobblestones, the clipped, disciplined rhythm of a German patrol. The sound sent a cold chill through my spine, and I instinctively flattened myself against the rough stone of the alleyway, the cool surface pressing against my back. The Germans were close, their voices low but sharp, barking orders to one another in a tone that brooked no argument. Louis, ever composed, barely breathed as he peered around a corner, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife. He carried a pistol, of course, but both of us knew that gunfire in the middle of Saint-Mir-Église would be suicide. The patrol passed slowly, their shadows stretching out long and menacing in the glow of a single street lamp. I counted 4 of them, all armed, their uniforms immaculate despite the mud caking the streets. One of them, a sergeant by the look of his insignia, paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the area, and I held my breath, praying that the shadows would be kind tonight. My fingers itched to reach for my own weapon, but I knew it would be useless unless I was ready to kill all 4 men before any of them could make a sound. Even then, the consequences would be dire. For what felt like an eternity, the German sergeant stood motionless, his head slightly tilted as if he could sense the wrongness in the air. Then, with a sharp exhale, he muttered something under his breath and motioned for his men to continue. I let out a slow, controlled breath as their footsteps faded into the distance, waiting until I was certain they were gone before turning to Lewis, whose expression remained unreadable in the dim light. That was close. I murmured in French, my voice barely more than a breath. Lewis scoffed softly, shaking his head. You have no idea. The Gestapo is here. They arrived this afternoon. They're searching for someone who fits your description. He gave me a meaningful look, his dark eyes sharp with warning. You've been compromised, mon ami. The words settled over me like a lead weight, my stomach twisting at the implication. Being hunted by the regular Wehrmacht was bad enough, but the Gestapo, that was something else entirely. The Gestapo didn't simply patrol the streets, hoping to catch suspicious activity. They dug their claws in deep, using informants, torture, whatever means necessary to extract information. If they were looking for me, it meant that someone somewhere had talked, or worse, that they were already closing in. I didn't have the luxury of panic. I had to think, had to act. How much do they know? I asked, my mind racing through possible escape routes, safe houses, contingency plans that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. Lewis hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Too much. Enough to know you're not just some lost traveler. Enough to know that an American has been working with us. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face before fixing me with a hard stare. We need to get you out of here. Tonight. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I had unfinished business, that the explosives we were supposed to receive tonight could cripple the German supply lines before the invasion even began. But I also knew Lewis was right. If I stayed, I wouldn't just be signing my own death warrant. I would be putting the entire network at risk. The Germans wouldn't stop at me. They would burn down villages, execute innocent people, do whatever it took to root out anyone connected to me. Still, leaving wasn't that simple. What about the drop? The shipment? I asked, my voice low but firm. If we miss it, we lose everything. The bridges, the railway, the fuel depots, it's all for nothing. Lewis sighed, his expression darkening. We'll figure something out. But you can't be here when they do. I knew he was right. And yet, as I looked out across the silent streets of St. Mireglise, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I ran, the war would always find me. I didn't argue not because I wanted to leave, but because I had learned long ago that debating with Lewis was as useless as trying to hold back the tide. He was stubborn, pragmatic, and most importantly, alive, qualities that only existed together in a resistance fighter if they knew when to run and when to fight. I, on the other hand, was still learning. That lesson had nearly cost me my life more than once, and it seemed I was about to be tested again. Lewis gestured for me to follow, moving through the alleyway with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating these streets under the cover of darkness. I trailed him, my senses sharp, my ears tuned to the slightest sound that might betray an unseen presence lurking in the shadows. The buildings pressed in around us, their crumbling stone walls and slanted roofs whispering stories of a France that had once been whole, before the war had carved wounds deep into its skin. Every corner we turned carried the weight of uncertainty. Would we find an empty street or the gleaming barrel of a German rifle? The thought made my pulse quicken, but I forced my breathing to stay steady. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. We moved fast but cautiously, slipping through side streets and narrow passages, avoiding the main roads where German patrols were likely to be stationed. The curfew had long since turned the town into a ghostly landscape where even the wind dared not disturb the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, short, sharp, alarmed. I tensed, my fingers tightening around the cold steel of my revolver, but Lewis didn't break his stride. That was the difference between us. I reacted to every noise, every shift in the darkness. He had learned to filter out the harmless from the deadly, a skill I had yet to master. We reached the edge of town without incident, slipping past the last row of houses where the cobbled streets faded into dirt paths that led toward the countryside. A dense thicket of trees loomed ahead, a welcome cover, but also a dangerous one. In the daylight, the wooded area would have been a sanctuary, a place to disappear without a trace. But at night, the darkness itself became a second enemy, hiding not only us but also whatever dangers lay waiting within. Lewis hesitated for the first time, his eyes scanning the tree line as if it might suddenly come alive with movement. I knew what he was thinking. The Gestapo wouldn't be searching the streets forever. Eventually, they would start hunting beyond the town limits, And if they had even the faintest suspicion that I had fled in this direction, the woods would become a trap rather than an escape. "We don't have much time," Lewis muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. "There's an old farmhouse about 3 kilometers from here. It's abandoned. We can rest there for a few hours, decide the next move." I didn't like the idea of stopping, but I knew that exhaustion made men reckless, and reckless men made mistakes. The night was far from over, and if I was to have any chance of making it out of Normandy alive, I needed to stay sharp. Without a word, I nodded, and we pressed forward, stepping into the thick embrace of the trees. The woods swallowed us in an instant, the shadows wrapping around our figures like a second skin. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, the scent thick and almost suffocating in the stillness of the night. Every step we took was measured, careful, our boots sinking softly into the forest floor. Despite the lack of moonlight beneath the dense canopy, Lewis seemed to know exactly where he was going, his movements precise, confident. I followed, trusting his instincts more than my own. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we moved deeper into the forest. The further we went, the more the tension in my chest began to ease. Maybe we had been lucky. Maybe we had managed to slip away unnoticed. Maybe. A branch snapped somewhere to our left. It was a small sound, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I froze, one hand immediately going to my weapon, my breath caught in my throat. Lewis had already stopped, his body rigid, his head slightly tilted as he listened. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching so long and thin that it felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Then another sound. A footstep, deliberate and slow. Not an animal. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Lewis turned his head slightly, his voice the barest thread of sound. "Only one," he murmured. "Maybe 2. It wasn't much of a reassurance. One German soldier was enough to raise the alarm. 2 meant we were outnumbered. If they had a radio. Another step. Closer this time. Lewis moved first. In a flash, he was gone from my side, melting into the darkness with a kind of silence that only came from years of practice. I barely had time to react before I felt a presence behind me, a shift in the air that sent my instincts into overdrive. I turned sharply, raising my revolver just as a figure lunged from shadows. A glint of steel. A knife? I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward as the blade sliced through the air where my throat had been a second earlier. My attacker was fast, but I was faster, my reflexes honed by months of living on the edge of survival. I fired once, the gunshot shattering the silence like a lightning strike. The figure jerked violently, collapsing to the ground with a dull thud. For a moment, there was nothing but the ringing in my ears. Then, another movement. I spun, expecting to see a second attacker, but instead, I saw Lewis standing a few feet away, his own knife glinting with fresh blood. The second man, because of course there had been 2, was already slumped against a tree, his body unnaturally still. Lewis exhaled slowly, his face unreadable in the darkness. So much for slipping away unnoticed. My grip tightened on the revolver, my pulse still hammering against my ribs. Think they had time to radio it in? He didn't answer right away. He crouched down beside the man I had shot, his fingers searching the body quickly, efficiently. When he came up empty-handed, his expression darkened. No radio. But that doesn't mean they weren't expected to check in. When they don't, he didn't need to finish the sentence. I already knew what it meant. The hunt was only just beginning. Lewis wiped the blood from his knife against the dead man's uniform in one quick, practiced motion, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, a slight shift in his stance that told me exactly what he was thinking. This wasn't just another close call. This was a warning, a sign that whatever illusion of escape we had been clinging to had just been shattered. We had been tracked, followed. Not by chance, not by some random patrol stumbling through the woods, but by men who had known exactly where to look. That meant the Gestapo was already ahead of us, tightening the net, cutting off our routes before we could reach them. And if they had gone to the trouble of sending men into the forest in the middle of the night, it meant they weren't just searching anymore. They were hunting. Lewis stood, sliding his knife back into its sheath with the ease of a man who had done it 100 times before, then gestured for me to move. "We can't use the farmhouse. If they expected us to come this way, they'll be watching it. We keep going." His voice was quiet, steady, But there was something else beneath the surface now. Urgency, calculation. He was already working through the possibilities, mapping out a new route in his head, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of men who, for all we knew, were already 5 steps ahead of us. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. He was right. We couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't afford even a moment to breathe. I took one last look at the bodies on the ground. 1 shot, 1 stabbed, 2 fewer enemies in a war where the numbers never seemed to shift in our favor, and then turned away, following Lewis deeper into the forest. The night felt heavier now, the darkness pressing in closer, no longer just an absence of light, but something alive, something waiting. Every tree became a hiding place, every rustling leaf a threat. I moved carefully, my footsteps softer than before, my senses straining for anything that felt wrong, but the woods gave away nothing. Lewis kept us moving at a steady pace, not too fast. Running would make too much noise, leave too many signs, but not slow enough to be cautious either. We had to get ahead of them, put distance between us and the point where those 2 men had last checked in. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for them, and when they found what we had left behind, the forest would become a war zone. For what felt like an eternity, we pressed on, moving through the tangled underbrush, crossing a shallow stream that soaked my boots, climbing a small incline where the trees thinned slightly, allowing glimpses of the open fields beyond. I could see faint lights in the distance, another village, or maybe just a single farmhouse, its occupants asleep, unaware of the war creeping toward them through the trees. I envied them for just a moment, that fragile illusion of peace. Lewis suddenly stopped, one hand raised in a silent command for me to do the same. I obeyed instantly, freezing in place, listening. At first, I heard nothing, only the whisper of the wind moving through the trees. But then voices, low, muffled, but unmistakably German. I dropped into a crouch instinctively, my heart hammering, my breath held tight in my chest. The voices weren't close, not yet, but they were moving. A patrol, maybe 2, spreading out, searching. If they were talking, it meant they weren't being cautious, which meant they still thought they were the ones in control. Lewis turned to me, his face barely visible in the dim light filtering through the canopy. "They're sweeping the forest," he murmured, his voice so low, I barely heard it. "We need to make them think we went another way." It took me a moment to understand what he meant, and when I did, I almost swore out loud. He wanted to split up. It was the worst possible idea under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. If we stayed together, we left a single trail, a clear path for the Germans to follow. If we separated, we doubled the chances that at least one of us would make it out. It was a cold calculation, brutal one, but in war, survival was often just another equation. Lewis saw the hesitation in my eyes and shook his head. "I'll draw them east, make some noise, give them something to chase. You head north, keep low, keep moving. There's an old mill near the river, abandoned for years. If you make it there, wait until sunrise. If I don't come, you go." I didn't like it. Every instinct screamed against the idea of leaving him behind, of running while he took the risk. But I also knew that arguing would only waste time, and time was something we had less and less of with every passing second. "Don't get killed," I said quietly, because what else was there to say? Lewis smirked, just barely, his usual cocky confidence peeking through the tension. "Don't be so dramatic, Henderson. I've been at this longer than you." And then, before I could say anything else, he was gone, slipping into the trees with the same impossible silence that made him such a ghost in this war. I stayed frozen for a moment, listening as his footsteps faded, waiting, barely breathing. Then suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the night, brief, deliberate, a call meant to be heard. And seconds later, the sound of movement. Boots crunching against fallen leaves. Germans turning toward the noise, taking the bait. I didn't wait to see if it had worked. I turned and ran. I ran, but not recklessly, not in a way that would leave a trail so obvious they could follow it even in the dark. Every movement was calculated, every step placed with the careful precision of a man who knew that a single snapped twig could mean death. My body wanted to move faster, to put as much distance between myself and the Germans as possible, but my mind knew better. The trick wasn't just to escape, it was to disappear. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, a shifting mass of shadows and tangled underbrush that threatened to pull me down with every step. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept moving, slipping between trees, ducking under low-hanging branches, changing direction just often enough to throw off anyone who might try to track me. I could still hear them behind me, though more distant now. The sharp voices, the occasional snap of a branch beneath a heavy boot, the deliberate sweep of a patrol hunting its prey. Lewis had given them something to chase. I just had to make sure they didn't change their minds. The river wasn't far now. I could hear the faint rush of water ahead, the low murmur of the current moving steadily through the night. The mill, if it was still standing, would be near the banks, hidden somewhere in the thick fog that always settled over the water in the early hours before dawn. I pushed forward, my body screaming for rest, my mind focused on only one thought: reach the mill. Reach the mill and wait. That was the plan. That was what Lewis had said. If he didn't come, I would leave. If he didn't come. The thought sat heavy in my chest, an unwelcome weight pressing against my ribs. I forced it down, shoving it into the part of my mind where all the other unspoken fears lived. Now wasn't the time. Survival came first. Everything else would have to wait. The ground beneath me shifted, turning from firm earth to something softer, damp. I had reached the edge of the river. The air smelled of wet stone and moss, thick with the cold bite of the water. The fog was denser here, curling around the trees like something alive, swallowing everything beyond a few meters into an impenetrable gray void. I moved carefully now, listening for anything that didn't belong, the crunch of footsteps, the distant murmur of voices, but there was only the water, the wind, and the restless rustling of unseen creatures moving in the underbrush. Either I had lost them, or they had lost interest. Neither possibility reassured me. The mill appeared suddenly, a hulking black shape looming out of the fog, its walls sagging, its roof partially caved in. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot, but it still stood, still offered the illusion of shelter. I stepped inside, my boots scuffing against the wooden floor, the old planks groaning beneath my weight. The interior was empty, save for the remains of rusted machinery and a few forgotten crates stacked haphazardly against the far wall. It smelled of dust, mold, and time. I crouched near one of the windows, peering through the broken glass, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. The fog had swallowed the world whole. I let out a slow breath, muscles still taut, nerves still raw. I had made it. Now I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. My fingers curled around the grip of my revolver, my mind cycling through every possibility, every outcome. Maybe Lewis had lost them. Maybe he was still leading them in circles somewhere deeper in the woods. Maybe. A sound. Soft. Barely there. A footstep against damp earth. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My heart pounded against my ribs as I strained to listen. Another step. Closer. Then Lewis's voice, low, controlled. "It's me." Relief hit me like a punch to the gut. So sharp and sudden, I almost laughed. I rose from my hiding place as he stepped into the mill, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through the broken walls. He looked the same, tired, tense, alive. There was blood on his sleeve, but he moved without hesitation, his expression unreadable as always. "You're late," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. He smirked, that familiar flicker of amusement cutting through the exhaustion. Had to make sure they stayed interested in me. He gestured vaguely behind him. "They'll be busy looking in the wrong direction for a while." I nodded, but I knew better than to assume we were safe. We had bought time, nothing more. Lewis glanced around the mill, his eyes scanning the shadows the way a soldier always did, always assessing, always calculating. "We can rest for a few hours," he said. Then we moved. "We need to get out of Normandy before sunrise." I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't matter. The war wasn't over, and as long as it continued, as long as there was still work to be done, we would keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. I leaned back against the wall, the exhaustion finally settling into my bones, heavy and unrelenting. The air was cold, the floor hard, the future uncertain. But for now, just for this moment, we were still alive.